Before Columbus ever touched a ship, before Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape, there were African kings who ruled the waves. From stone cities carved from coral, they sent fleets into the vast blue. Their sails caught the monsoon winds, not in exploration, but in mastery. Their names were whispered in the markets of Calicut, the ports of Arabia, and along the spice routes of Asia. They were the Swahili, and they were the kings of an ocean most history books ignore. But who were they really? How did African city-states, centuries before colonialism, become powerhouses of global trade? How did cities like Kilwa and Zanzibar rise from the sand and coral to command respect from empires as far as China? And perhaps more hauntingly, why did the world forget? This is not just a history lesson, it's a resurrection. We've been taught that Africa's glory began only after contact, as if brilliance needed permission to exist. But the Swahili Coast tells a different story, one of opulence, strategy, culture, and resilience. A story built not on conquest, but on connection with Arabia, with India, with Southeast Asia. They didn't just participate in global trade, they helped define it. As we sail down this forgotten coastline, from the minarets of Lamu to the spice gardens of Zanzibar, you'll witness the rise of African merchant kings. You'll explore mosques that rivaled the architecture of Persia, hear of coins stamped with African sultans' names, and discover how language, fashion, and even food became a beautiful blend of worlds. And in doing so, we'll ask the questions history dared to bury. What happened to this maritime golden age? Why did it vanish from our collective memory? And what echoes of its power still remain today? If you've only ever seen Africa through the lens of struggle, prepare for your worldview to shift. Because today we dive into a chapter lost in the tides of time, a story of coral, sails, gold, and glory. Welcome to the Swahili Coast, where Africa ruled the ocean. These weren't scattered villages or backwater outposts. They were sophisticated city-states with diplomacy, law, and art that rivaled their contemporaries. They built libraries, minted coins, negotiated alliances, and wrote poetry in a blend of Arabic and African tongues. Their boats, called mtepe, were masterpieces of engineering, sewn together without a single nail, yet strong enough to cross oceans. Even their language, Swahili, stands today as a monument, a living, breathing reminder of a civilization that once stood at the crossroads of the world. 1,000 years ago, the East African coast was not a forgotten margin of the world. It was a pulse, a place of winds, waves, and rhythms carried on ocean tides. It stretched from modern-day Somalia all the way down to Mozambique, dotted with bustling port cities, each a node in a network of power that would shape global trade. But what gave birth to this civilization? It began with geography and with the monsoon. Each year the winds reversed. For half the year they blew from Arabia to Africa. Then they shifted, blowing back. These winds became a highway for trade, and the Swahili people mastered it. Long before foreign merchants arrived, coastal Bantu communities were already fishing, boat building, and trading among themselves. But starting as early as the 7th century, Arab and Persian merchants began arriving, bringing not conquest, but commerce. Over time, their cultures mixed with the local African ones, creating something entirely new. The Swahili. The name itself tells the story. Swahili comes from the Arabic word sawahil, meaning coasts. But what emerged wasn't just coastal, it was cosmopolitan, African at its core, but layered with Arabic words, Islamic beliefs, Persian aesthetics, and Indian influences. What followed was a cultural explosion. Families intermarried, mosques were built, languages fused, and perhaps most powerfully, a new identity was born, one that didn't belong entirely to Africa, Arabia, or Asia, but flowed through all three. By the 10th century, the Swahili Coast was no longer a frontier. It was a civilization. City-states like Shanga, Lamu, and Mombasa began to rise. Their houses were made from coral stone, their markets filled with silks, ceramics, incense, and spices. Islam spread not through force, but through trade and social prestige. Merchants, scholars, and mariners gathered in these cities, which soon became centers of not just wealth, but learning. These cities weren't ruled by kings in the way Europe imagined. Power was diffuse, often managed by wealthy families and merchant elites. There were sultans, yes, but they ruled more by negotiation than decree, and their authority was shaped as much by trade alliances as by military might. The Swahili civilization was urban, refined, and literate, long before much of Europe emerged from the Dark Ages. They wrote poetry in Arabic script, kept detailed trade logs, and built towering mosques that echoed with the call to prayer. Religion was important, but not radical. Islam in the Swahili world blended with local customs, creating a spiritual rhythm that embraced both desert wisdom and coastal spirit. And still, beneath it all, was the ocean. It was their highway, their protector, their soul. As African dhows glided across the water, the Swahili carved out not just wealth, but independence. They didn't need empires to rule them. They had the sea, and the sea gave them everything. What's most remarkable, though, is how they saw themselves. The Swahili didn't define themselves by race. Identity wasn't built on skin color, but on culture, lineage, language, and city. This defies modern notions of ethnic separation and speaks to a much older, richer idea of what civilization could be. And yet, despite their power and sophistication, the Swahili left little in the way of written historical narratives. Much of what we know comes from foreign visitors, Arab geographers, Chinese sailors, and later Portuguese explorers who were stunned to find grand cities where they expected primitive villages. Imagine their shock. Gold-tipped minarets, coral palaces, tiled fountains, and bazaars as lively as any in Baghdad or Delhi. This was Africa, but not the Africa of their maps. This was an Africa in command, and at its heart was a people who built a world not with walls or war, but with sails, trade, and story. The birth of the Swahili coast was not an accident of wind and tide. It was an intentional, elegant creation, forged by people who looked outward, welcomed the world, and made something new from every sail that arrived. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving and setting the stage for something even greater. By the 11th century, the Swahili coast had evolved into something few could imagine, a string of African city-states commanding one of the most lucrative trade routes in the ancient world. They didn't just dabble in commerce, they dominated it. Kilwa Kisiwani was the jewel, a city of coral stone and gold coin perched like a throne on the Tanzanian coast. Arab chroniclers marveled at it. Portuguese explorers, when they finally arrived, could hardly believe what they saw. A city more refined, more powerful, and more wealthy than anything they'd imagined in Black Africa. Why? Trade, and lots of it. The Swahili city-states formed a tight commercial web, exporting goods from the African interior and importing treasures from the far corners of Asia and the Middle East. Gold mined from Great Zimbabwe traveled overland to Kilwa. Ivory from elephant herds was loaded onto dhows in Lamu. Leopard skins, tortoise shell, ebony, and even enslaved people all found their way onto the bustling Swahili markets. And in return, the riches of the East, Chinese porcelain, Persian rugs, Indian spices, Arab perfumes. Every monsoon season brought a new tide of goods, and the Swahili cities transformed into seasonal superports, alive with deal-making and diplomacy. Their harbors became floating marketplaces. Ships creaked under the weight of goods. Dock workers shouted in Swahili, Arabic, and Gujarati. Scribes kept tallies. Merchants bargained over silk bolts and sandalwood. And high above it all, minarets cast shadows over stone courtyards where gold dinars changed hands and foreign ambassadors toasted with coconut wine. What made this trade possible wasn't just geography, it was innovation. Swahili ships were marvels of engineering. Their mtepe, sewn from planks using coconut fiber rope, could ride the waves with uncanny flexibility. Their sailors read the stars and the winds like scripture. They didn't just wait for monsoons, they mastered them. But their greatest innovation was social trust. The Swahili built powerful commercial networks based not on conquest, but on collaboration. They used contracts, partnerships, and reputation to fuel their economies. A merchant in Malindi could trust his goods would be honored in Hormuz. A sultan in Mombasa could negotiate prices with a trader from Gujarat because they spoke the same cultural language. And yet, power was never just economic. The Swahili city-states had military capabilities, fleets of armed dhows and soldiers loyal to merchant guilds. But their influence came more from soft power, the allure of luxury, the magnetism of prosperity, and the promise of security. They didn't need empires to back them. Trade was their empire. At their height, these cities sparkled with a grandeur that rivaled any European kingdom. Kilwa minted its own gold coins, a bold statement of sovereignty. Mogadishu exported textiles so prized that even Egyptian markets demanded them by name. Zanzibar, soon to rise, would become the spice capital of the world, supplying cloves to the furthest reaches of empire. This was not a passive Africa waiting to be discovered. This was an Africa that had already discovered the world. And as ships left African ports loaded with goods and dreams, they carried something else too: culture. Swahili language, dress, architecture, and ideas flowed eastward, embedding pieces of Africa into the heart of Asia. The world came to the Swahili coast for riches, but it left with something deeper, a taste of African sophistication. Yet, with every golden age, there's a shadow. As we'll soon see, the wealth that made the Swahili powerful also made them targets. But for now, at the height of their power, the ocean kings reigned supreme, their sails bright under the sun, their harbors echoing with the hum of a civilization at its prime. They weren't a footnote in someone else's empire. They were the empire, and the ocean was theirs. If the Swahili coast was a string of pearls, Kilwa and Zanzibar were the most luminous of them all. Each was a crown jewel, one carved from coral and gold, the other perfumed with clove and cinnamon, and both stood as proud, undeniable proof of African brilliance. Let's begin with Kilwa. To understand Kilwa Kisiwani is to understand a forgotten miracle. Located on a small island off today's Tanzanian coast, it was once the most powerful city-state on the Swahili coast. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Kilwa controlled the gold trade coming from deep within southern Africa. Gold from Great Zimbabwe passed through its ports, and with it came power, the kind of power that could build empires. And build they did. The architecture of Kilwa was like nothing else in sub-Saharan Africa. Using coral stone as their medium, Swahili builders erected multi-story buildings, intricately carved doorways, and vast courtyards that opened into the sea breeze. The Great Mosque of Kilwa, the oldest standing mosque on the East African coast, once had over 100 stone columns. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was a declaration. Kilwa was a metropolis of traders, nobles, clerics, artisans, and sailors. It had mint houses that produced gold coins, palaces with vaulted ceilings, and public baths inspired by Persian design. Kilwa was not copying the outside world, it was conversing with it. But every conversation has two voices. Enter Zanzibar. Zanzibar wasn't always a powerhouse, but as Kilwa waned, Zanzibar rose, especially with the growing demand for spices. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Zanzibar had become synonymous with clove, the brown gold of the Indian Ocean. It was no longer just a trading post, it was the capital of one of the richest spice empires in the world. But spice was only part of the story. Zanzibar also became a cultural powerhouse, a melting pot of African, Arab, Persian, and Indian influences. Stone Town, its historic heart, was a labyrinth of narrow alleys, wooden balconies, and intricately carved doors, each a chapter in a swirling, syncretic story. Music echoed through the streets, tarab, a haunting blend of African rhythm and Arabic melody. The food, a fusion of tamarind, coconut, cardamom, and chili, as layered and rich as the culture itself. Swahili here wasn't just a language, it was a lifestyle. Women wore brightly colored kanga, each patterned with Swahili proverbs. Men wore kofia caps and white robes, gathering for coffee and conversation. Life moved with rhythm, with ritual, with elegance. But beneath the beauty was complexity. Zanzibar, like many Swahili cities, was also entangled in the darker threads of trade, particularly the slave trade. While Swahili elites did not invent slavery, they became participants in a brutal economy driven by demand from Arabia and the Ottoman world. This is part of the story, too. Power and pain often traveled the same roads. Still in their heights, both Kilwa and Zanzibar represented the finest of Swahili achievement. They were living proof that Africa was not a blank slate waiting to be written on, but a canvas already rich with its own masterpieces. They stood tall, not in defiance of the world, but in full participation, shaping, sharing, leading. Tourists today walk the ruins of Kilwa, feeling the echo of footsteps on coral stone. They wander Zanzibar's markets, breathing in cloves and history, but most have no idea what they're truly standing on. These cities weren't the sidelines of history, they were the stage. And the next time someone tells you Africa had no cities, no architecture, no brilliance, tell them about Kilwa, tell them about Zanzibar, tell them about the cities that grew from coral and spice and ruled the sea with nothing but wind, wood, and wisdom. For centuries, the story of the Swahili Coast has been buried, not by accident, but by design. When European explorers finally reached East Africa in the late 15th century, what they found shocked them. Grand mosques, bustling markets, literate elites, and global trade routes in Black Africa. It didn't fit the colonial narrative, so they rewrote it. Portuguese invaders described Swahili cities as foreign colonies. British scholars labeled the architecture Arabic or Islamic, denying its African roots. The myth spread that Africa was a passive recipient of civilization, not a creator of it. That Africans didn't build these cities, didn't sail these seas, didn't mint these coins. But archaeology tells another story. Excavations in Kilwa, Shanga, and Gedi reveal layers of Swahili life stretching back over 1,000 years. Tools, inscriptions, and pottery made locally, not imported. Architecture built using indigenous coral techniques, long before any Europeans set foot on the coast. Even the Swahili language itself, a Bantu tongue at its core infused with Arabic, is a living testament to Africa's cultural agency. It wasn't a gift from outsiders. It was forged by Africans reaching out, mixing, adapting, creating. So why erase it? Colonial powers couldn't justify domination if they admitted Africa had cities more advanced than their own. A narrative of primitivism had to be maintained. Africa, they said, had no history, only darkness, only wilderness. This lie seeped into textbooks, into classrooms, into the global imagination. Even today, many people outside Africa, and sadly, many within, have never heard of the Swahili city-states. They know the pyramids. They may know Mali, but Kilwa, Lamu, Malindi, these names were scrubbed from the collective memory, and the result? A continent with a stolen past, and a world poorer for not knowing it. But that is changing. In recent decades, African historians, linguists, and archaeologists have been reclaiming the narrative, reconnecting the threads, rebuilding the record, telling the story not as a counterpoint to Europe, but as its own triumph. Because history is not a competition, it's a tapestry. And the Swahili Coast is one of its richest, most intricate threads. Still, myths linger. That Africans couldn't sail, that they didn't trade, that Islam was imposed by sword rather than embraced by curiosity. These are shadows, long, stubborn ones. But shadows disappear in the light, and that's why this story matters. Reclaiming the Swahili legacy isn't about nostalgia, it's about truth, it's about pride. It's about giving future generations a mirror in which they can see greatness, not borrowed but born on their own shores. Africa was never isolated, never waiting. It was moving, building, dreaming. The Swahili Coast wasn't a backwater, it was a beacon. And now, as we peel back the myths, we rediscover the brilliance they tried to bury. A civilization of traders and poets, architects and astronomers, sultans and sailors. Their story didn't end. It was interrupted, and now it's returning. Every golden age eventually faces its twilight. And for the Swahili Coast, that twilight came with sails on the horizon. Not African dhows, but Portuguese caravels, armed with cannons and imperial ambition. In 1498, Vasco da Gama arrived on the East African coast. He wasn't a trader seeking friendship. He was a soldier of empire. And with him came a new era, one defined not by mutual exchange, but by domination. What the Portuguese saw terrified and fascinated them. They expected primitive villages. Instead, they found fortified cities, powerful sultans, and well-organized maritime networks. Cities like Kilwa and Mombasa didn't bow, they negotiated. But the Portuguese weren't interested in diplomacy. They wanted control, and they took it with fire. In 1505, they bombarded Kilwa. Mombasa followed. Great stone buildings crumbled under cannon fire. Palaces burned, mosques were desecrated, and the Swahili world, which had thrived for centuries through trade and soft power, was suddenly thrust into an age of militarized European greed. The Portuguese weren't the only threat. Internal rivalries among Swahili city-states made unity difficult. As competition grew fierce, some cities allied with Europeans or Arabs, hoping to preserve influence. But this only hastened fragmentation. Then came the Omanis, who pushed out the Portuguese in the 17th century. Zanzibar became their new capital, but by then the Swahili civilization as it had once existed, independent, Afrocentric, oceanic, was no longer the same. It had been absorbed into larger imperial systems, and yet it didn't vanish. Like the tides that once carried its ships, the Swahili legacy receded, but never disappeared. Today, its echoes remain everywhere. In language, Swahili is still spoken by over 100 million people across East and Central Africa. A blend of Bantu roots and Arabic rhythm, it's a living, breathing archive of cultural fusion. In architecture, coral stone buildings still line the coasts of Lamu, Mombasa, and Zanzibar. Ornate doors carved with verses and symbols whisper stories of old merchant kings. In identity, Swahili culture survives in food, music, poetry, and ritual. It lives in taarab melodies, in the scent of cloves, in the tide-driven wisdom passed down from sailor to sailor. Even in loss, there is persistence. The Swahili Coast may have lost its fleets, its palaces, its power, but it did not lose its soul. it remains one of the greatest maritime civilizations the world has ever seen. Not in spite of being African, but because it was African. And that legacy, once nearly erased, is rising again, carried not by empire, but by memory, pride, and truth. The kings of the sea are no longer forgotten. They are remembered, revered, and restored. So now you know, the Swahili Coast was never silent. It was never sleeping, never waiting for the world to find it. It was already awake, already brilliant, already global, from coral cities that shimmered under the equatorial sun, to gold coins stamped with African names, to spice-scented streets that hummed with 1,000 languages. The Swahili world was a masterpiece, a reminder that Africa was not merely shaped by history, it was a shaper of it. This story matters, because too often we've been fed a narrow version of the past, a version where greatness wears only one face, speaks one language, and sails under one flag. But history is richer than that, deeper, more colorful, and the Swahili Coast, with its sails, spices, and stories, proves it. It tells us that Africans weren't just in history, they were making it. That trade could be as powerful as war. That identity could be built not on isolation, but on connection. And it tells us something else too, something deeply human, that memory is fragile. Civilizations rise and fall, cities crumble, languages fade, but stories can survive if we tell them. So tell this one. Tell someone about Kilwa's coral palaces, about the gold of great Zimbabwe flowing through African hands, about the Swahili sailors who mapped the Indian Ocean with nothing but wind, stars, and instinct. Because when we remember, we reclaim. When we share, we honor. And when we learn, we grow. Let the Swahili Coast remind us that greatness doesn't have a single origin. It has many. And some of the greatest were written on the winds of the Indian Ocean by African kings who ruled not by sword, but by sail. If this story moved you, inspired you, or even surprised you, share it. Let it ripple across timelines and across minds. Let it be the beginning of a new curiosity, a new pride, a new hunger to know more. Because the past isn't gone. It's just waiting to be rediscovered. And the Swahili Coast, Africa's forgotten ocean kingdom, is calling. Like, subscribe, and dive deeper into the stories they never taught us, because history belongs to all of us.